My name is Madison. I am 33 years old, and I stood shivering in my parents' driveway, staring at my life packed into black trash bags. My father, William, stood on the porch, his face red with rage as he screamed at me, "Get out, you lowlife! You are nothing but uneducated trash and a burden to this family." Instead of crying or begging for a second chance, I simply smiled, picked up my bags, and replied, "Okay, fine." I turned and walked away without shedding a single tear. What my family did not know was that I was quietly closing a software acquisition deal worth $40 million. If you have ever been treated like a failure by the people who were supposed to love and support you unconditionally, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear exactly how I made my family regret the day they threw me away. To understand how we reached that explosive moment on the driveway, we have to go back 3 weeks earlier. I moved into my parents' dark, damp basement in Chicago. It was not because I was a failure, even though that is the narrative my family loved to push. The truth was far more lucrative. I dropped out of community college at 20, a decision my parents never forgave me for. But I dropped out to teach myself to code. Over the next decade, I poured my energy into building an artificial intelligence platform to optimize supply chain logistics. By the time I turned 33, my software had caught the attention of corporate buyers. I was closing an acquisition deal with a massive private equity firm. The legal due diligence required for a $40 million acquisition is expensive. I needed to pay corporate lawyers to ensure the intellectual property transfers were bulletproof. Every dollar I had was tied up in legal fees. To save cash during this final phase, I asked my parents if I could stay in their basement for a month. They agreed, but made sure I paid for it in daily humiliation. My parents, William and Susan, owned a trucking logistics company. They projected immense wealth to their Chicago Country Club friends, but their business was failing. They constantly projected their deep financial stress onto me, turning every conversation into an argument about my supposed lack of ambition and my embarrassing life choices. They treated my presence as an unbearable financial burden despite me paying for my food. To them, I was the dropout who played on a computer all day, while my sister Brittany was their shining star. Brittany was 30, had a Harvard Master of Business Administration degree, and worked as an investment director. I was just the ghost in the basement, working on my encrypted laptop, waiting for my escrow account to clear. I kept my $40 million deal an absolute secret. If my parents found out about the money, they would demand a massive cut to save their sinking business. I needed to stay invisible. I thought I could endure their passive-aggressive behavior for a few more weeks, telling myself the ultimate payoff would make the suffering worth it. But my family had other plans. The final confrontation happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. I came up from the basement to grab a glass of water and found my mother Susan and my father William standing in the kitchen, holding heavy black trash bags filled with my clothes. Susan glared at me with absolute disgust. "We are done, Madison," she announced coldly. "You need to pack the rest of your junk and leave tonight." I stared at the trash bags in shock. "Mom, I just need 2 more weeks," I pleaded calmly. "I am working on a major project that is about to finish." My father scoffed loudly. "A major project? You are playing video games in our basement while real adults are out working." Just then, the front door opened. Brittany walked in wearing a pristine designer suit, followed closely by her husband Jamal. Jamal was a 32-year-old African-American Wall Street financial analyst, incredibly arrogant, and he never missed an opportunity to remind me of my lowly status. They walked into the kitchen, and Jamal immediately started laughing when he saw my clothes in the garbage bags. "Well, look at this," Jamal sneered, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored jacket. "The 33-year-old dropout is finally getting the boot. If you need money for a cheap Motel Madison, I can lend you $200. Just do not make it a habit of begging us for cash. You need to learn how to be a waitress or something." Brittany stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hand resting on Jamal's arm. "We need the basement, Madison," she said with an entitled smirk. "Jamal and I are starting a financial advice podcast, and we need the space to build a custom recording studio. My time is literally money, and I cannot have my brand associated with a sister who lives like a teenager in our parents' basement." Susan nodded enthusiastically. "Brittany is an investment director, Madison. Her career actually matters. You are just a burden to this family, and you are stunting your sister's growth." I looked at my parents, then at Brittany, and finally at Jamal, who was looking me up and down with pure contempt. They were kicking me out onto the street so they could record a podcast. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked past them, went down the stairs, and grabbed the only thing that mattered: my encrypted laptop containing the source code to my $40 million software. When I walked back upstairs and out the front door, I left them standing there bathing in their own arrogance, completely unaware of the empire I was about to unleash. I stepped off the porch and ordered a premium ride service. The heavy Chicago rain beat against the pavement, washing away the last traces of my past. I climbed into the sleek black car, instructing the driver to head straight to the Gold Coast district. I watched the familiar suburban streets fade into the rearview mirror. My parents probably assumed I was heading to some run-down motel or a homeless shelter, clutching Jamal's hypothetical $200. In reality, my destination was a $5 million luxury penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The corporate brokers facilitating my software acquisition had arranged this high-end corporate housing for me weeks ago, ensuring I had a secure and private location to finalize the massive contract. When the driver pulled up to the glittering glass tower, a uniformed concierge greeted me by name and escorted me to the private elevator. The door slid open directly into my new sanctuary. The sheer contrast between my previous living conditions and my actual reality was almost comical. For weeks I had been suffocating in a damp, moldy basement with cinder-block walls, a single tiny window, and the constant thud of footsteps above my head. Now I stood in a sprawling, open-concept masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling windows, displaying the magnificent Chicago skyline. The floors were imported white marble, and modern art pieces decorated the expansive living area. A smart home system automatically adjusted the lighting and temperature the moment I walked inside. I dropped the cheap plastic trash bags containing my clothes onto the pristine entryway floor. They looked completely out of place in this palace of wealth. But I did not care about the clothes. I carefully took my encrypted laptop out of my backpack and placed it gently on the massive quartz kitchen island. That machine held my life work. Before I could even take off my wet coat, my phone began to vibrate violently against the quartz countertop. A barrage of notifications lit up the screen. It was the family group chat. They were continuing their campaign of humiliation, completely unaware that they were texting a woman standing in a $5 million penthouse. I opened the application and watched their toxic messages roll in one by one. My father, William, was the first to assert his dominance. "Tough love is what you need, Madison," he wrote. "We cannot keep enabling your lazy lifestyle. Stop playing on your computer and get a real job. You need to face reality and understand that the world does not owe you anything." My mother, Susan, chimed in immediately after him, desperate to echo his cruelty. "We gave you a roof over your head, and you showed zero gratitude. You should have been offering to clean the house or cook for Brittany and Jamal to pay us back for our generosity." Then came the message from my sister. Brittany always needed to assert her superiority, wielding her Harvard degree like a weapon to strike down anyone she deemed beneath her. "Do not expect Jamal and me to bail you out when you end up on the streets," she typed. "We work too hard for our money to waste it on a loser. Uneducated trash like you does not understand the pressure of real success. You chose to be a failure the minute you dropped out." Jamal could not resist joining the attack. He sent a mocking, laughing emoji, followed by his own arrogant commentary. "Next time you see us, you better be serving our table at whatever diner hires you. Try not to mess up the drink orders dropout." I read every single word they wrote. A few years ago, These messages would have crushed my spirit. They would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and depression. I would have believed their cruel narrative that I was nothing but a burden, a failure, a disappointment, who would never amount to anything. But tonight, their words held absolutely no power over me. Their insults were just empty echoes bouncing off the walls of my luxury high-rise. They were judging a version of me that no longer existed. Instead of typing out an angry response, instead of defending myself or trying to prove my worth, I simply pressed the options button and muted the family group chat entirely. Silence was my strategy. Arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of time. I walked over to the built-in wine fridge tucked beneath the custom cabinetry. The corporate brokers had thoughtfully stocked it with premium vintages as a welcome gift. I selected a rare Cabernet Sauvignon, uncorked the bottle, and poured the rich red liquid into a large crystal glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex flavors ground me in the present moment. I walked over to the towering glass windows and looked out over the glittering city lights shining brightly below. I had survived their abuse. I had escaped their toxic household. The worst was finally behind me. Just as I took another sip of wine, my phone rang. It was not a text from my arrogant family. The caller identification clearly displayed the name of my lead acquisition broker. I accepted the call and brought the phone to my ear. "Good evening, Madison." His professional voice sounded clearly through the small speaker. "I am calling you tonight to deliver the absolute final update. The buyer has officially signed off on all the technical due diligence. The escrow account is active and fully funded today. The transaction is moving safely to the final clearing stage." The words washed gently over me, bringing an overwhelming sense of profound relief and absolute victory. I thanked him, ended the call, and stared down quietly at the glowing screen of my phone. The $40 million software deal was officially secure. My family thought they had destroyed me tonight, but they had merely set the stage for my own ultimate triumph. I kept the phone pressed securely to my ear, the sheer magnitude of my lead broker's words settling over me. His name was David, and he had been my most trusted advisor through this grueling corporate process. "You did it, Madison?" David said, his voice dropping its formal tone for a moment of genuine warmth. "I have worked with hundreds of tech founders, but your personal journey is the one I will never forget." I leaned against the cool glass window, looking out at the city below. "It took a long time to get here," I replied quietly. 13 years, David affirmed. "You walked away from community college at 20. Most people would have panicked. But you sat down, taught yourself complex coding languages from scratch, and built an artificial intelligence architecture that no one else could figure out." He was exactly right. When I dropped out, my family branded me an absolute failure instantly. They refused to understand that traditional education was suffocating my specific kind of analytical thinking. Instead of sitting in crowded lecture halls learning outdated theories, I spent a decade locked in my bedroom, staring at dual monitors until my eyes burned. Those 13 years were built on cheap ramen noodles, isolated weekends, and relentless debugging while my family mocked every choice I made. They saw me staring at screens and called it a lazy addiction. They never realized I was single-handedly writing thousands of lines of machine learning code that would disrupt an entire global industry. I analyzed international shipping routes, warehouse inefficiencies, and freight delays. I built a predictive artificial intelligence supply chain logistics platform that could foresee and reroute global shipping bottlenecks before they even happened. You built a system that saves multinational corporations billions in wasted logistics costs." David continued, his voice filled with deep respect. "You started with nothing. No degree, no venture capital backing, no wealthy connections. You just wrote brilliant code, and now you are cashing out at the very top of the market." I smiled, taking another sip of my wine. "I appreciate you pushing this through the finish line, David. I know my refusal to do in-person meetings made your job significantly harder. Your complete anonymity was part of the charm." He chuckled warmly. The buyer was absolutely obsessed with acquiring the phantom coder who revolutionized modern logistics. Speaking of our highly motivated buyer, the final counter-signatures from their executive board are complete. Apex Capital is thrilled to close this, David added. Their private equity division rarely moves this fast, but their technology acquisition team knew your software was a rare unicorn. They wanted to lock you down before any rival firms caught wind of your logistics platform. I felt a sharp, highly ironic smile form on my lips at the mere mention of the buyer. Apex Capital was a massive, ruthless private equity firm known for swallowing up tech startups and optimizing distressed corporate assets. It was also the exact same firm where my sister Brittany worked. Brittany the self-proclaimed genius of the family held the title of investment director at Apex Capital. She strutted around Chicago in designer suits, boasting about her elite Harvard credentials and her high-power career. She constantly berated me for being uneducated, claiming I could never comprehend the complex financial strategies she dealt with every single day. The universe had a truly wicked sense of humor. Brittany went into the office every morning completely oblivious to the fact that her prestigious employers were desperately scrambling to buy a company built by her dropout sister. She spent her days managing million-dollar portfolios while actively mocking me, never suspecting that the executive board above her was currently wiring $40 million to my private account. If Brittany had bothered to look past her own blinding arrogance, if she had ever once asked what I was actually doing on my laptop, instead of insulting me, she might have recognized the software architecture her own firm was trying to buy. But her ego blinded her completely. She assumed a college dropout was incapable of creating value, entirely unaware that her firm was cutting its largest technology acquisition check of the year to the very woman she had just kicked out of a damp basement. "I will send over the final closing docket for your personal records," David said, wrapping up the conversation. "Congratulations again, Madison. Your funds are cleared." We exchanged brief professional pleasantries before I ended the call. The sprawling penthouse was incredibly quiet, a stark contrast to the screaming and insults I had endured just hours ago. I set my wine glass down on the quartz counter and opened the secure banking application on my phone. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. There was no frantic anxiety, only a deep, solid certainty. I authenticated my secure login with my biometric scan. The application loaded a small spinning icon, delaying the inevitable for one final second. Then the screen refreshed. Available balance $40 million. I stared intently at the numbers. The 8 zeros stretched across the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light of the luxury kitchen. I did not scream or jump up and down. I did not pop champagne or dance around the living room. Instead, I simply closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. A profound sigh of relief escaped my lips. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family evaporated entirely. The years of being called useless, the endless lectures about my lack of ambition, the harsh eviction into the rainy Chicago night, all of it was suddenly rendered completely irrelevant. I had won. The ultimate vindication was secure, locked safely behind a fortified firewall of wealth that my family could not even fathom. They had demanded I face reality. Well, my reality was now $40 million in liquid cash, and their reality was a toxic delusion built on pure arrogance. Tomorrow, my new life would officially begin. 2 days later, I was fully immersed in the quiet luxury of my new life. I had transformed the secondary bedroom of the penthouse into a state-of-the-art command center, installing curved monitors and high-speed servers that hummed softly in the background. The transition from a damp, noisy basement to a pristine, silent workspace was still surreal. I spent my morning finalizing the handover protocols for Apex Capital, ensuring the migration of my primary artificial intelligence databases went perfectly smoothly. The deal was closed, the money was resting securely in my accounts, and my obligations to the corporate world were technically over. I poured myself a fresh cup of espresso and leaned back in my ergonomic chair, ready to shut everything down and finally take a real vacation. But before I could close my main terminal, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed through the spacious room. The screen flashed a bright warning red. It was an urgent, automated ping originating directly from my cloud security dashboard. I immediately set my coffee mug down and focused intently on the incoming data stream. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I pulled up the primary security logs. Someone was actively trying to breach my network. This was not a random automated bot scanning for vulnerabilities. This was a targeted manual intrusion. I watched the live telemetry feed as the unauthorized user attempted to bypass a legacy firewall connected to one of my offline backup servers. It was an old repository, a localized storage node I used years ago during the initial beta testing phases of my supply chain software. The security architecture on that specific node was intentionally outdated, designed to act as a decoy honeypot to trap potential corporate spies. I had never bothered to update its encryption protocols because the data housed inside was disconnected from the live $40 million platform. Whoever was on the other end was aggressively running brute force decryption scripts trying to rip the raw source code out of the backup server. They were clumsy, leaving massive digital footprints across the server logs. They did not possess the sophisticated finesse of a professional hacker, but they were highly determined. I disabled the automated lockdown sequence, choosing instead to leave the back door slightly ajar. I needed to know exactly who was arrogant enough to attack my infrastructure just 48 hours after I closed the biggest deal of my entire life. I initiated a reverse trace protocol, locking onto the hostile signal. The intruder was exceptionally careless, failing to route their connection through a secure virtual private network or properly mask their digital signature. It took my tracking software less than 30 seconds to isolate the origin point. Lines of code cascaded down my monitor as the geographical location narrowed from the state level down to the city of Chicago, and finally to a highly specific residential coordinate. I stared at the physical address displayed on my screen, my blood running ice cold. The unauthorized Internet Protocol address did not belong to a rival tech company or an anonymous foreign entity trying to steal trade secrets. It originated directly from the residential wireless network of my parents, William and Susan, the exact same house I had been violently evicted from just 2 nights ago. My mind raced to make logical sense of the incoming data. My parents could barely operate a smartphone, let alone run complex decryption scripts to penetrate a cloud-based server. William struggled to attach simple files to his emails, and Susan thought the internet was a magical cloud she could not touch. They possessed zero technical literacy. There was absolutely no chance either of them was sitting in their living room trying to execute a cyber attack against my network. That meant someone else was inside their house utilizing their local network to access my servers. Someone with enough financial motivation and basic technical knowledge to attempt a corporate data heist. I pulled up the device identification tag linked to the invading computer. The system registered an expensive high-end business laptop, the exact model issued to corporate analysts working on Wall Street. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. During the chaotic, humiliating eviction from the basement while William was screaming at me and Susan was throwing my clothes into garbage bags, I had been entirely focused on securing my primary encrypted laptop. I had grabbed my main machine and walked out the door without looking back. But in my haste to escape their toxic presence, I had forgotten to empty the bottom drawer of the small metal desk I used. Tucked away in that drawer was an old, unencrypted, solid-state external hard drive. That drive contained the offline backup keys and the foundational source code for my entire supply chain software platform. Jamal and Brittany, the arrogant Wall Street financial analyst and the Harvard-educated investment director. They had demanded the basement for their podcast studio. When they went downstairs to clear out the rest of my belongings, they must have found the hard drive. Jamal, with his finance background, knew enough about tech valuations to recognize raw source code when he saw it. Brittany, working in private equity at Apex Capital, understood the exact market value of a functional artificial intelligence logistics platform. They did not just find my drive, they stole it. They plugged it into Jamal's corporate laptop, found the legacy server keys, and were now actively attempting to download the entirety of my life work. They thought I was just an uneducated dropout who played meaningless games on a computer. But the moment they saw the complex algorithmic structures on that drive, their insatiable greed took over completely. They were trying to steal my software right out from under me. I leaned closer to the curved monitors, my initial shock rapidly transforming into calculated precision. I did not sever their connection. Severing the connection would immediately trigger an error message on Jamal's laptop, alerting them that the system administrator was actively watching. Instead, I opened a hidden terminal window and deployed a silent packet sniffer to monitor exactly what data they were extracting. I watched in real time as Jamal and Brittany clumsily navigated through the complex directories of my legacy server. They were bypassing the superficial text files and digging straight into the foundational architecture of the machine learning models. Line by line, gigabyte by gigabyte, they were siphoning off the core artificial intelligence algorithms that powered the predictive supply chain routing. It was a digital heist happening right before my eyes, executed by the very people who had spent years calling me an uneducated burden. They were downloading the neural network training sets, the predictive bottleneck models, and the automated freight allocation scripts. Jamal was clearly driving the operation, utilizing basic finance industry data, scraping tools that were laughably loud on my end. He was leaving massive digital footprints across my server logs with every folder he opened. He truly thought he was being a master corporate spy, completely unaware that I was logging his every keystroke, device identification, and network location from a luxury penthouse across the city. The sheer audacity of their actions was breathtaking to witness. They had kicked me out of their basement into the freezing rain, mocked my entire existence, and then immediately turned around to steal the precise work they had constantly ridiculed. I could see the exact moment they located the primary source code directory. The data transfer rate spiked significantly on my dashboard. They were pulling the proprietary architecture that took me a decade of isolated, sleepless nights to perfect. I let them take it. I let them download the entire legacy repository because I knew a crucial detail they did not. The code on that specific backup drive was heavily watermarked with invisible digital signatures permanently linking the intellectual property back to my personal corporate entity. Every single line of code they stole was a federal crime waiting to be prosecuted. I sipped my wine and smiled a cold, predatory smile as the progress bar on my monitoring software finally hit 100%. The download was officially complete. They had successfully stolen the entire decoy package. Now I needed to find out exactly what these arrogant fools intended to do with my stolen property. Jamal was a Wall Street financial analyst, which meant he was incredibly arrogant, but predictably lazy regarding personal cybersecurity. I ran a quick background scan on his device network and discovered he was automatically syncing all his downloaded files to a commercial cloud storage drop. His cloud account was protected by a painfully generic password, likely a combination of his birth year and his college fraternity. It took my password cracking algorithm less than 2 minutes to completely bypass his pathetic security measures. I gained full administrative access to his personal cloud drive and opened the newly created folder where he had just dumped my stolen source code. Resting right next to my life work was a beautifully designed corporate presentation. I clicked open the file labeled Apex Capital Pitch Deck. What I saw inside made my blood boil and my mind race with absolute clarity. Brittany and Jamal had taken my highly complex artificial intelligence platform and lazily rebranded it as their own invention. They called it B Logistics. The title slide proudly displayed Brittany's name as the visionary founder and chief executive officer, with Jamal listed as the chief financial officer. I scrolled through the polished presentation slides. Brittany had used her Harvard business education to wrap my technical achievements in shiny corporate buzzwords. She claimed to have spent the last 2 years secretly developing this revolutionary logistics software to disrupt the global supply chain industry. The presentation detailed how her brilliant algorithmic architecture could save multinational shipping companies billions of dollars annually. It was a perfect word for word theft of my actual business model. But the final slide of the pitch deck revealed their true endgame. Brittany and Jamal were planning to present this stolen software directly to the executive board of Apex Capital next Wednesday. They were asking the private equity firm for a $5 million initial seed funding round. Furthermore, the pitch included a bold executive restructuring demand. Upon securing the seed funding, Brittany required an immediate promotion from investment director to vice president of technology acquisitions at Apex Capital. They were utilizing my genius to secure massive corporate funding and propel Brittany to the top of the Wall Street food chain. They honestly believed they could steal an artificial intelligence platform from their dropout sister, slap a new logo on it, and sell it to the very private equity firm that had just paid me $40 million for the genuine version. The level of delusional arrogance was staggering. Brittany went to work every single day at Apex Capital completely blind to the fact that her boss, the chief executive officer, had just signed off on acquiring my legitimate company. She was planning to walk into a boardroom next week and confidently pitch stolen goods to the exact people who already owned the copyright. I sat back in my chair, staring at the stolen pitch deck glowing brightly on my monitor. They had handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy them. I did not need to call the police or file a lengthy civil lawsuit. I just needed to let them walk directly into their own execution. The trap was already set, and they had eagerly locked themselves inside. I leaned forward, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. They wanted to steal my future to elevate their pathetic social standing. By next week, Brittany and Jamal would step into that gleaming corporate boardroom expecting a massive financial victory. Instead, they would find me waiting for them, ready to absolutely decimate their fraudulent careers and their carefully constructed lies forever. The very next morning, I shifted my focus from corporate espionage to massive wealth structuring. I walked into the ultra-exclusive offices of Vanguard Financial Partners, a private wealth management firm that catered specifically to high-net-worth individuals. My new lead wealth manager, a sharp executive named Carter, had cleared his entire morning schedule to help me diversify the $40 million currently sitting in my secure escrow account. We sat in his glass-walled conference room, overlooking the Chicago River, sipping artisanal coffee while reviewing complex investment portfolios and tax optimization strategies. I needed to establish a discrete holding company to manage my assets and shield my identity from public registries. As part of the standard onboarding protocol for establishing an elite corporate trust, Carter ran a comprehensive background and credit analysis using my social security number. I leaned back in my leather chair, expecting a perfectly clean slate. I had no mortgage, no car payments, and no lingering student debt. My financial history was a ghost town by design. But Carter suddenly frowned, his fingers tapping rapidly against his keyboard. He adjusted his glasses and looked across the table with a highly concerned expression. "Madison," he said carefully, "there seems to be a severe anomaly on your personal credit report. Did you recently authorize a massive commercial liability?" I sat forward, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "I have zero outstanding debts. I have operated strictly on a cash basis for the past 8 years." Carter turned his large monitor so I could see the screen. Right here, he pointed to a glaring red alert on the financial dashboard. "You have a highly delinquent active commercial loan attached directly to your social security number. It was issued 6 months ago by a predatory lending institution." I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the lines of the credit report. The principal amount was staggering. Someone had taken out a $150,000 loan in my name. My pulse quickened, but I forced my analytical mind to take over. I demanded Carter pull the origination documents and trace the exact destination of the funds. I needed to know exactly who had stolen my identity. Within 10 minutes, Carter utilized his premium banking access to pull the original commercial loan application. He printed the documents and slid them across the sleek conference table. I picked up the heavy stack of paper, and the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The primary beneficiary of the $150,000 high-interest rescue loan was a Chicago-based transportation firm. It was my parents' trucking logistics company. William and Susan had deliberately stolen my identity. I read through the forged documents with absolute disgust. The financial filings painted a pathetic, desperate picture of my parents' supposed wealthy lifestyle. Their logistics company was completely bankrupt. They were drowning in massive commercial debt, defaulting on their fleet leases and bleeding cash daily. Yet, they still paid their expensive country club dues and bought designer clothes to maintain the illusion of upper-class success to their arrogant friends. To save their sinking ship, they needed a fast cash injection, but their own credit was entirely destroyed. So they turned to the daughter living in their basement. On page 4 of the loan agreement, right under the guarantor section, was my forged signature. William and Susan had legally bound me to a predatory loan with a ruinous interest rate, effectively turning me into their financial human shield. They committed federal identity theft without a single second of hesitation. The psychological calculation behind their crime was the most sickening part. They chose to forge my signature because they genuinely believed their vicious own narrative about me. To them, I was just an uneducated community college dropout who played useless games on a computer. They assumed a 33-year-old failure living in a basement would never have the financial literacy to check her own credit score. They were absolutely certain I would never apply for a mortgage, never attempt to secure a business loan, and certainly never sit in a high-rise conference room with an elite wealth manager. They viewed me as entirely disposable, a naive loser they could exploit and discard at their convenience. The absolute audacity of their actions was almost difficult to process. Just 3 weeks ago, William had screamed in my face, calling me a low-life burden. Susan had thrown my meager belongings into cheap plastic garbage bags and kicked me out into the freezing rain. They had demanded I stop being a parasite on their perfect family. Yet at that exact moment, they were actively using my stolen identity to illegally fund their fake bankrupt existence. They threw me out onto the street while secretly chaining a $150,000 anchor around my neck, fully expecting it to drag me down and destroy my financial future forever. I set the forged documents down on the table, my hands perfectly still. There were no tears left to cry for these people. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously held was instantly eradicated, burned to ash by the undeniable proof of their malicious criminality. Carter watched me cautiously, ready to call the authorities. "We need to contact the federal authorities immediately, Madison," he advised gravely. "This is a severe felony. You are the victim of substantial financial fraud." I looked at the forged signatures, then up at Carter. A cold, calculating fury settled deep inside my chest. "No," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "Calling the police right now would be far too easy for them. They would just hire a defense attorney and drag this out in court for years, playing the victim the entire time. They want to play high-stakes corporate games." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the loan document. "Who currently holds the debt for this specific commercial loan?" Carter typed quickly. "It looks like the predatory lender packaged the debt and sold it to a larger institutional buyer last month. The current holder of the debt is a private equity firm. Apex Capital." A dark, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The universe was handing me the perfect weapon. Apex Capital, the very firm that was currently buying my software for $40 million, owned my parents' fraudulent debt. And Brittany, the sister who called me uneducated trash, was an investment director at that exact same firm. "Do not call the police, Carter," I instructed softly. "Instead, I want you to initiate a discreet corporate maneuver. I am now a major equity partner at Apex. I want to personally purchase this specific debt portfolio from them. I am going to buy my parents' bankruptcy." Carter's eyes widened as he understood the ruthless magnitude of my strategy. "I am going to let them walk onto their biggest stage," I continued, "and then I am going to pull the floor right out from under them. I left Carter's office and immediately instructed my team to assemble a corporate war room. Within 2 hours, I was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table in a secure corporate law firm high above the bustling Chicago streets. Surrounding me were 5 of the most ruthless corporate litigators and intellectual property specialists in the entire Midwest. I did not hire them to negotiate a peaceful resolution. I hired them to execute a flawless, inescapable legal trap. I connected my encrypted laptop to the overhead projector and laid out the evidence piece by piece. First, I showed them the digital forensics. I projected the live packet sniffer logs, proving exactly when and how Jamal and Brittany had bypassed my legacy server firewall. I displayed the network traces originating directly from my parents' residential internet protocol address. Then I pulled up the stolen presentation, the B Logistics pitch deck that Brittany planned to use to secure $5 million from Apex Capital. I placed my original federally copyrighted source code right next to their stolen slides, highlighting the exact algorithmic architecture they had lazily copied and pasted into their fraudulent business plan. Next, I dropped the physical copies of the forged commercial loan documents onto the center of the table. I watched the senior litigator, a sharp-eyed man named Harrison, pick up the paperwork. He examined the fraudulent signatures and the predatory interest rates William and Susan had chained to my social security number. Harrison looked up, astounded by the arrogance and stupidity of the crimes. "This is an absolute slam dunk," Harrison stated firmly, tapping his pen against the desk. "We have federal intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. We can file an emergency injunction this afternoon. Send a formal cease and desist to Apex Capital and have the federal authorities arrest your entire family by tomorrow morning." The entire legal team nodded in agreement, already drafting the injunctions in their heads. They wanted a swift, quiet, and legally standard resolution. But a quiet resolution was the absolute last thing I wanted. "If we sue them now," I explained, keeping my voice dangerously level, "we give them time to panic. We give them time to hire expensive defense attorneys, to spin a narrative of a family misunderstanding, to hide assets, and to plead for quiet settlements out of court. They will play the victim to their country club friends and claim I am an ungrateful daughter, destroying them over a simple technical error." I stood up and paced the length of the conference room. I do not want a quiet settlement. I want a highly public execution. I want them to step onto the biggest stage of their miserable lives, completely confident in their fraudulent success, and I want to destroy them in front of the exact people they are desperately trying to impress. I instructed the legal team to prepare all the lawsuits, the federal criminal referrals, and the debt acquisition papers, but to hold them under a strict embargo until I gave the final signal. Then I stepped into a private soundproof booth in the office and dialed a direct unlisted number. The phone rang only twice before Richard answered. Richard was the chief executive officer of Apex Capital, the very man who had just authorized my $40 million payout. He was a notorious Wall Street shark, a man who built his private equity empire by being utterly ruthless and entirely intolerant of corporate liabilities. Madison Richard greeted me, his voice booming with genuine enthusiasm. "I was just reviewing the final integration reports. Your software is already exceeding our efficiency projections. What can I do for my newest and most valuable equity partner?" "Richard," I replied smoothly, "I am calling to request a highly specific favor regarding your upcoming annual investor gala next Wednesday. I understand you have a packed agenda of internal pitches." Richard chuckled confidently. "Yes, our standard dog and pony show. We let our mid-level directors pitch new ventures to the executive board." "Why do you ask?" "Because I said, leaning against the cold, soundproof glass, one of your investment directors, a woman named Brittany, is scheduled to pitch a logistics artificial intelligence project called B Logistics." I paused, letting the silence hang for a split second. "That software is an exact stolen copy of the proprietary source code you just paid me $40 million for." The jovial warmth vanished from Richard's voice, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating corporate fury. "Excuse me," he demanded softly. I explained everything to him. I detailed how his own employee, along with her financial analyst husband Jamal, had stolen my encrypted hard drive during a family dispute. I explained how they were planning to defraud Apex Capital out of $5 million in seed funding while simultaneously demanding a promotion to vice president. I also informed him that Apex currently held the distressed debt portfolio containing a forged $150,000 loan taken out by William and Susan, the parents of his fraudulent investment director. Richard listened in absolute silence. A chief executive of his caliber despised being played for a fool, and he utterly loathed corporate espionage operating inside his own firm. "So what is your exact play here, Madison?" He finally asked, his voice deadly serious. "You could have just sent my legal department a notice. You want something else. I want you to invite me to the gala as your guest of honor," I told him. "I want you to introduce me on stage to your entire executive board as the genius who actually built the logistics software. I want to be standing right there on the platform the exact second Brittany walks into the ballroom expecting to pitch her stolen company. Furthermore, I want to publicly call in my parents' fraudulent debt in front of the entire city elite." I could practically hear Richard smiling through the phone. He was an apex predator and he deeply respected a flawless, bloodthirsty corporate maneuver. "Consider it done," Richard agreed without a single moment of hesitation. "It will be the grand finale of the evening. We will let them walk right into the slaughterhouse." I ended the call and walked back into the conference room where my legal team was waiting. The trap was officially set. My family was about to dress up in their absolute finest clothes, rent expensive cars, and proudly march directly into their own complete annihilation. I finalized the legal embargo with my corporate litigation team and returned to my penthouse to coordinate the absolute final logistical details of the ambush. My phone vibrated with a highly encrypted message from Richard. The chief executive officer of Apex Capital had just sent over the finalized digital guest roster and the seating chart for the upcoming annual investor gala. I opened the file on my curved monitor and initiated a secure voice call with him. Richard answered immediately, the distinct sound of a busy Wall Street trading floor echoing faintly in his background. "Madison," he said with a sharp tone of amusement, "you are going to find the updated attendance list particularly entertaining." I brought the digital document up on my screen and scrolled straight to the reserved seating section. There, printed in bold corporate font, were the names of my family. Brittany had formally registered Jamal, William, and Susan as her premier VIP guests for the evening. I asked Richard how she managed to secure 3 premium seats at an exclusive closed-door private equity event. Richard let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Your sister marched directly into my executive assistant's office yesterday afternoon. She aggressively demanded front-row access for her family. She claimed she was bringing a revolutionary logistics software to the firm and insisted her parents needed to be present to witness her sealing a $5 million seed fund. She even had the audacity to mention that she expected to be promoted to Vice President of Technology Acquisitions by the end of the night, and she wanted her husband to photograph the exact moment it happened." The sheer magnitude of Brittany's delusion was astounding. She was a mid-level investment director walking around Apex Capital like she already owned the entire building, completely blind to the reality that she was carrying stolen federal property in her briefcase. Jamal was likely fueling her arrogance, using his Wall Street analyst ego to convince her that their fraudulent pitch was entirely foolproof. I looked at the seating chart and quickly adjusted the digital layout. "Richard," I said smoothly, "I want their seats moved to the absolute direct center of the front row. I want them sitting exactly 10 feet away from the main podium. When I project my source code onto that massive screen, I want to see the exact moment the blood drains from their faces." Richard agreed instantly. He was a ruthless corporate predator who despised being played, and Brittany had insulted his firm by attempting to fence stolen intellectual property in his own boardroom. He assured me that his elite security team would be stationed at every single exit of the ballroom. There would be absolutely no quiet escape for my family. Once the trap snapped shut, They would be forced to sit under the bright spotlights and face the full, devastating weight of federal corporate law. We finalized the timeline of the stage announcements and ended the call. The execution was perfectly set. While I was meticulously planning their total financial and professional annihilation in my luxury penthouse, William and Susan were busy spending my stolen identity at their pretentious suburban country club. I later learned the exact details of this afternoon from a mutual family acquaintance who had the misfortune of sitting at their table. My parents were lounging on the manicured outdoor patio, sipping expensive imported champagne they were paying for with the $150,000 loan they had fraudulently attached to my Social Security number. They were surrounded by affluent business owners and local socialites, desperately putting on a theatrical performance of massive generational wealth. William wore a custom-tailored linen suit, loudly boasting to the table about how his trucking logistics company was currently experiencing record-breaking quarterly profits. It was a complete fabricated lie. His trucks were being repossessed, his drivers were quitting, and his corporate accounts were utterly bankrupt. Susan sat next to him, flashing a diamond tennis bracelet and dominating the conversation with endless praise for her golden child. "You simply must come to the Apex Capital Gala this Wednesday," Susan bragged to a wealthy couple sitting across from her. "Our daughter Brittany is unveiling a groundbreaking artificial intelligence software. She built it entirely from scratch in her spare time. The executive board is so impressed they are promoting her to vice president immediately." The table offered polite, impressed murmurs. Susan did not stop there. She proudly brought up Jamal, making sure everyone knew her son-in-law was a brilliant African-American Wall Street financial analyst who was instrumental in structuring Brittany's multi-million-dollar tech venture. They painted a pristine, untouchable picture of a dynasty destined for infinite success. They reveled in the fake admiration of their peers, intoxicated by the illusion of their own superiority. Then one of the country club wives innocently asked about their other daughter. The table grew quiet for a fraction of a second. William sighed heavily, placing his champagne flute down with a practiced look of profound parental disappointment. "We do not speak about Madison," William said, shaking his head dramatically. Susan immediately chimed in, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured sorrow. "We tried everything to help her succeed, but she is an uneducated community college dropout who absolutely refuses to work hard. She wanted to sit in our basement playing useless computer games all day while we paid her bills. We finally had to practice tough love and throw her out onto the street. You cannot enable a lazy 33-year-old burden forever. We assume she is waitressing at some cheap diner, now learning about the real world the hard way." The wealthy couples nodded in sympathetic agreement, praising William and Susan for making such a difficult but necessary parenting decision. My parents smiled, clinking their glasses together to toast their own brilliant parenting and Brittany's imminent fortune. They sat there in the warm afternoon sun, overflowing with extreme arrogance, utterly and completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward them. They thought they had buried me in the dirt. They had no idea they were casually drinking champagne on the very edge of their own freshly dug graves. Wednesday finally arrived with the exact kind of crisp, clear Chicago morning that signaled absolute perfection. I woke up in the silent luxury of my penthouse, completely rested and deeply focused. Today was the day of the Apex Capital Investor Gala. For an event of this magnitude, most women in my previous socioeconomic position might have panicked and rushed out to buy a glittering, overly embellished ball gown to prove they finally belonged in the high society room. I had absolutely zero interest in looking like a decorative accessory. I was not attending this gala to be paraded around for wealthy spectators. I was attending to execute a hostile corporate takeover of my own family. I opened my massive walk-in closet and bypassed the formal evening dresses entirely. My wardrobe choice was a highly calculated strategic decision meant to dominate. I pulled out a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The fabric was immaculate, structured with aggressive shoulders and a perfectly tapered waist that radiated absolute, undeniable authority. I paired the suit with a crisp white silk button-down shirt and sleek black stiletto heels that echoed sharply against the marble floor. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe style that left my face completely exposed and entirely unreadable. I applied minimal makeup, just enough to accentuate the cold, predatory focus burning in my eyes. When I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, the transformation was astonishing. I did not see the vulnerable, exhausted woman who was thrown out of a damp basement and into the freezing rain 3 weeks ago. I saw a lethal corporate predator ready to step into the financial jungle and tear her arrogant prey apart, limb by limb. I grabbed my secure encrypted tablet and logged in one final time. I double-checked the presentation files, ensuring the slide deck comparing my copyrighted source code to their fraudulent pitch was queued up perfectly. Everything was completely flawless. I secured the tablet in my structured leather briefcase and headed down to the private underground garage. A discreet black luxury sedan provided by Richard was already waiting to take me to the Apex Tower. I slipped into the quiet, temperature-controlled leather back seat, my heart beating with steady, calculated precision. I watched the city skyline pass by the tinted windows. I was walking directly into the epicenter of Chicago wealth, completely armed with the truth and $40 million in liquid capital. Across the city, a vastly different scene was unfolding in the driveway of my parents' suburban home. Jamal had gone to absurd lengths to manufacture an illusion of massive wealth for the evening. Unable to afford a luxury vehicle on his analyst's salary, he had maxed out a high-interest credit card to rent a bright red, exotic Italian sports car for 24 hours. He stood by the driver's side door, smoothing down his flashy designer tuxedo, desperately trying to project the image of a seasoned Wall Street heavyweight. He honestly believed pulling up to the Apex Tower in a rented supercar would instantly convince the billionaire executives that he belonged in their elite ranks. Brittany sat rigidly in the low passenger seat, completely ignoring her husband's pathetic vanity display. She was frantically flipping through a stack of thick white pitch cards, her perfectly manicured nails tapping aggressively against the expensive leather dashboard. She was obsessing over every single corporate buzzword, loudly muttering the stolen technical specifications of my artificial intelligence platform. Her anxiety was skyrocketing. She snapped viciously at Jamal to stop adjusting his tie and focus on the driving route, terrified that being even 1 minute late would ruin her guaranteed promotion to vice president. Following closely behind Jamal's rented sports car was a premium black car service carrying William and Susan. They had paid for the extravagant chauffeur service using the exact same fraudulent $150,000 loan they had illegally tied to my Social Security number. They sat in the spacious back seat, acting like literal royalty on their way to a coronation. Susan wore an overly embellished, heavily beaded evening gown that screamed new money desperation, while William wore a tuxedo that was noticeably too tight around his waist. They sipped complimentary bottled water and complained loudly to the driver about the downtown traffic, behaving as if they personally owned the city streets. Susan spent the entire ride rehearsing how she would casually mention Brittany's multi-million-dollar seed funding to the other investors in the room. They were entirely wrapped in their own grand delusion, completely convinced that tonight would cement their status as a legendary Chicago business dynasty. As their two vehicles navigated through the congested downtown streets, the tension inside both cars built to a fever pitch. Jamal gripped the steering wheel tightly, his palms sweating against the leather as the towering glass and steel structure of the Apex Capital headquarters finally came into view. The sheer scale of the skyscraper was deeply intimidating, casting long, dark shadows over the surrounding financial district. Jamal pulled the loud, bright red sports car aggressively into the VIP valet lane, revving the engine one final time to ensure everyone nearby noticed his arrival. He stepped out of the vehicle and tossed the keys to the valet attendant with a forced, arrogant smirk. Brittany emerged from the passenger side, clutching her stolen presentation files against her chest like a protective shield. William and Susan stepped out of their black car service a moment later, instantly raising their chins and looking down their noses at the surrounding pedestrians. They grouped together on the pristine concrete sidewalk, adjusting their expensive clothes and sharing a collective look of supreme, unearned confidence. They truly believed they were finally about to conquer the corporate world. They squared their shoulders, marched toward the massive revolving glass doors of the Apex Tower, and confidently stepped right into my trap. The massive revolving glass doors of the Apex Tower swept my family out of the cool Chicago evening and directly into a sanctuary of overwhelming corporate power. The grand foyer was an architectural marvel, designed specifically to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings stretched 40 feet overhead, supported by sleek pillars of brushed steel and imported black marble. A massive cascading indoor waterfall created a low, constant roar that somehow muted the conversations of the elite crowd gathered below. This was not a standard networking event. This was a summit of apex predators. Billionaire hedge fund managers, global tech moguls, and venture capitalists mingled quietly, exchanging polite nods that represented sudden shifts in the global economy. Into this arena of absolute financial titans walked my parents, my sister and her husband, completely out of their depth, but desperately pretending they belonged. Brittany immediately marched up to the front reception desk, flashing her standard employee badge with an exaggerated flick of her wrist. She expected the security detail to part like the Red Sea for her, but the imposing guards barely offered her a cursory nod, treating her like just another mid-level employee clocking in for a shift. She swallowed her intense irritation, quickly plastering on a fake, overly enthusiastic smile as she ushered William and Susan past the velvet ropes. My parents were trying incredibly hard to act natural, but their physical discomfort was blatantly obvious. Susan clutched her sequined evening bag so tightly her knuckles were turning pale white. Under the sophisticated ambient gallery lighting of the lobby, her heavily beaded dress suddenly looked incredibly cheap and completely out of place among the sea of minimalist custom-tailored couture. William attempted to project masculine dominance, puffing out his chest and striding confidently toward a group of tech executives. He aggressively inserted himself into their private conversation loudly, introducing his failing trucking company as a major national logistics empire. The executives simply stared at him with polite, freezing indifference, exchanging brief glances before swiftly excusing themselves to speak with someone who actually mattered. They were drowning in massive imposter syndrome. Every single person in that room possessed actual, verifiable generational wealth. Meanwhile, William and Susan were standing there holding crystal glasses of complimentary champagne paid for by the very firm that currently owned their fraudulent debt. They were putting on a pathetic, desperate performance of high society success, entirely unaware of how transparent their act was to the seasoned billionaires surrounding them. This environment was designed to separate the real players from the pretenders, and they were failing the test completely. Jamal was faring no better. His rented tuxedo felt increasingly tight and uncomfortable as he watched young, effortlessly wealthy venture capitalists casually discussing nine-figure acquisitions. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, hoping no one noticed his mounting anxiety. He needed a stiff drink to steady his rapidly fraying nerves, quickly excusing himself from Brittany to head toward the expansive open bar situated at the far end of the marble lobby. Jamal approached the glowing onyx-topped bar, adjusting his posture to mimic the relaxed confidence of the men standing next to him. He ordered a glass of the most expensive scotch available, trying desperately to sound like a man who drank premium spirits every single night. He took his glass, turned his back to the bar, and began to carefully survey the massive glittering crowd. He was actively looking for an opening, a conversation he could smoothly interrupt to hand out his business card and magically elevate his Wall Street status. His eyes drifted slowly upward, scanning past the crowded main floor and landing directly on the VIP mezzanine. The mezzanine was a highly restricted elevated glass balcony overlooking the entire grand foyer. It was strictly guarded by Apex Capital security personnel wearing earpieces entirely inaccessible to regular attendees or mid-level employees like Brittany. It was a space exclusively reserved for the firm's senior executive board and their most highly valued equity partners. Jamal narrowed his eyes, squinting hard against the bright ambient lighting. A woman was standing right at the edge of the glass railing, looking down at the packed crowd with an expression of cold, calculated dominance. She was wearing a razor-sharp midnight blue Tom Ford suit. Her posture was immaculate, her physical presence commanding absolute, undeniable authority. Jamal froze completely. The heavy crystal glass of scotch halted halfway to his mouth. He blinked rapidly, his brain forcefully rejecting the visual information his eyes were transmitting. He rubbed his eyes with his free hand, convinced the intense pressure of the evening was causing him to actively hallucinate. He stared harder, his heart rate spiking dangerously. It was me, Madison. The 33-year-old dropout he had mocked and offered $200 for a cheap motel, the burden he had gleefully kicked out of a damp basement just 3 weeks ago. I was standing in the most secure elite section of the Apex Tower, holding a glass of sparkling water and looking directly back at him. A massive wave of pure, unfiltered panic crashed over Jamal. The cognitive dissonance was entirely shattering his reality. I was supposed to be serving tables at a greasy diner or sleeping in a homeless shelter. I was absolutely not supposed to be standing behind heavy velvet VIP ropes in a custom designer suit at an exclusive billionaire gathering. He abandoned his expensive scotch, slamming the glass down onto the bar so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. He did not care about networking anymore. He pushed his way through the dense crowd of tech moguls, sprinting across the marble floor. He stepped on expensive shoes and shoved past wealthy investors, sweating profusely inside his rented tuxedo. He finally reached Brittany and Susan, who were busy trying to force a conversation with a disinterested hedge fund manager. Jamal grabbed both of their arms with a crushing grip, pulling them away from the crowd. His eyes were wide with terror as he pointed a shaking finger up toward the glass balcony. "She is here," Jamal hissed frantically, his voice cracking with panic. "Madison is up there." Brittany followed Jamal's shaking finger, her eyes snapping upward to the glass mezzanine. The color drained from her face for a fraction of a second before her shock ignited into pure venomous rage. William and Susan quickly crowded around them, following their gaze. There I stood looking down at them from the highly restricted sanctuary of the Apex Capital elite. I did not break eye contact. I held my glass of sparkling water perfectly still, watching them scramble to comprehend my presence. Brittany aggressively shoved her way through a group of affluent venture capitalists, ignoring their indignant protests. She marched directly toward the velvet ropes guarding the VIP staircase, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Jamal, William, and Susan flanked her like a furious, misguided infantry. They honestly believed I had stalked them to the venue. They were entirely convinced I was a desperate, homeless dropout trying to crash their monumental evening to beg for cash. As they reached the imposing velvet barrier, two massive Apex Capital security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking their path with crossed arms. The guards glared at my family, ready to eject them from the building. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I slowly descended the grand glass staircase, my midnight blue custom suit catching the gallery lighting. Every step I took was deliberate and commanding. I approached the velvet rope, standing just inches away from my seething family with the security guards flanking me like my own personal army. Brittany sneers, her face twisted with absolute disgust. She leaned over the velvet rope, keeping her voice in a harsh, frantic whisper to avoid drawing the attention of the billionaires surrounding us. "How did you sneak past security?" she demanded, her eyes darting nervously toward the guards. "Are you completely insane? Did you actually follow us here to ruin my promotion? You are a pathetic stalker, Madison. You do not belong anywhere near this building." Susan pushed her way forward, her heavily beaded dress rustling loudly. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family." Susan hissed, her face turning a blotchy red. "We told you to stay out of our lives. Did you sneak in through the service elevator? If Richard or the executive board sees you loitering around in here, Brittany will lose her funding. Go back to whatever homeless shelter took you in." I stood perfectly silent, letting their arrogant delusions flow over me. Their panic was palpable. They were terrified that my mere presence would somehow shatter their carefully constructed illusion of high society success. They assumed I had bypassed the security checkpoints to sabotage Brittany's stolen artificial intelligence pitch. I did not flinch. I did not break my composed posture. I simply watched them unravel, allowing the heavy silence to amplify their frantic, desperate energy. They were squirming under the weight of their own massive insecurities, desperately trying to project superiority while standing on the wrong side of the velvet rope. Jamal stepped forcefully to the front of the group, attempting to assert his dominance. He puffed out his chest inside his rented tuxedo, pointing an aggressive finger directly at my face. "You think renting a cheap suit makes you belong here?" Jamal threatened, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "This is Wall Street, Madison. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at Jamal, taking in his sweating forehead and his ill-fitting rented clothes. He was a low-level financial analyst pretending to be a master of the universe. He actually believed he possessed the authority to have me removed from my own corporate acquisition gala. I raised my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cool liquid refreshed my throat as I offered him a cold, empty smile. I provided zero resistance. I offered absolutely no explanation for my presence. I did not mention the $40 million escrow account, nor did I bring up the stolen hard drive currently sitting in Brittany's briefcase. I just smiled. My silence infuriated them more than any argument ever could. William stepped up next to Jamal, his face dark with parental rage. "Listen to me very carefully," William commanded, speaking to me as if I were a disobedient child. "You are going to turn around, walk out the back door, and disappear. If you do anything to jeopardize your sister's $5 million seed fund tonight, I will personally ensure you never find a job in this city. You are a dropout. You are nothing. Do not test me." I maintained my absolute stillness. My lack of reaction completely short-circuited their aggressive tactics. They expected me to cry, to scream, or to beg for their forgiveness. They needed me to act like the broken, helpless victim they had actively created. By refusing to engage in their toxic dynamic, I denied them the satisfaction of control. Brittany scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder with a sharp, arrogant movement. "She is mute because she knows we are right," Brittany declared to her husband and parents. "She knows she is completely outmatched. Let her stand here and watch me secure the vice president title. Maybe she will learn what real success looks like. Just do not let security catch you stealing the complimentary appetizers, Madison." Jamal let out a harsh, mocking laugh, feeling immensely victorious. He adjusted his rented bow tie, convinced his threat of arrest had successfully intimidated me into submission. He wrapped his arm around Brittany's waist, pulling her away from the velvet rope. "Come on," Jamal said loudly. "We have an executive board to impress. Let the trash take itself out." Susan and William shot me one final look of profound disgust before turning on their heels to follow the golden couple toward the main ballroom doors. They walked away with their heads held high, completely intoxicated by their own manufactured dominance. I stood at the VIP rope and watched them march directly toward the execution block. I took one final sip of my sparkling water, the crisp bubbles mirroring the electric anticipation building in my veins. The trap was perfectly set, and they had just eagerly locked the cage doors behind them. Just as they reached the massive brass-plated doors of the main ballroom, I gave a subtle nod to the security detail standing beside me. Without a single word, the imposing guards unclasped the heavy velvet rope, stepping aside in perfect synchronization to allow me to pass. I stepped off the elevated mezzanine and began walking directly behind my family toward the venue entrance. William happened to glance over his shoulder. The look of smug satisfaction instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, visceral panic. He aggressively nudged my mother, pointing back at me. Susan spun around, her heavily beaded dress shimmering harshly under the gallery lights. Seeing me casually strolling toward the highly restricted ballroom was entirely too much for her fragile ego to handle. She completely abandoned her forced high society composure. Leaving Brittany and Jamal to proceed through the doors, Susan broke away from the group and marched directly back toward me. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hostility. Before the security guards could intervene, Susan lunged forward and grabbed my left forearm. Her manicured fingernails dug sharply into the sleeve of my custom-tailored suit. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "Are you trying to ruin your sister's big night out of pure jealousy?" Susan hissed, her breath hot against my face. "You could not stand the fact that we threw you out, so you came here to embarrass us in front of the most important people in the city. Go back to the gutter where you belong, Madison. You are a disgusting parasite trying to feed off your sister's hard work." William quickly closed the distance between us, standing uncomfortably close to my face in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. He looked around nervously, terrified that the wealthy venture capitalists walking past us might overhear the confrontation. "I told you to leave this building instantly," William demanded through gritted teeth. "You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a private multi-million-dollar investment gala, not a charity kitchen for unemployed dropouts. We gave you everything and you threw it away to be a lazy burden. Now Brittany is about to become a vice president, and you are desperately trying to steal her spotlight. I will not let you ruin my legacy. If you take one more step toward those ballroom doors, I will personally drag you out onto the street. You are an ungrateful, jealous failure, and I am sick to my stomach just looking at you. Get out of our sight before I make you regret ever showing your face here tonight." I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my arm. Her knuckles were white with tension, driven by a desperate need to control a narrative that was already completely dead. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice to match their frantic energy. I gently, but with absolute unyielding firmness, removed her hand from my jacket. I smoothed out the immaculate fabric of my sleeve, maintaining steady, piercing eye contact with both of them. My perfectly calm demeanor deeply unsettled them. They expected a defensive argument, a tearful retreat, or a screaming match they could easily win by playing the victims. They were entirely unprepared for my absolute serenity. "Do not worry, Mom," I said softly, a cold smile playing on my lips. "I am just here to watch the pitch. I would not miss it for the entire world." Susan stared at me, completely baffled by my response. William opened his mouth to launch another volley of insults, but before he could speak, a commanding presence materialized right beside me. It was the head of security for Apex Capital, a towering man in a crisp black suit with an earpiece resting discreetly on his collar. He did not look at my parents at all. He focused entirely on me, offering a respectful, highly deferential bow of his head. "Right this way, ma'am," the head of security announced, his voice projecting unquestionable authority across the marble lobby. "We have your premium seat prepared right at the absolute front of the main stage, exactly as you requested." William and Susan froze entirely. The aggressive posture instantly drained from my father's shoulders as he processed the profound respect the senior security chief had just directed toward me. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the head of security extended his arm, personally escorting me past them. I walked right between my parents without offering them another single glance. I glided smoothly through the towering brass doors and stepped into the main ballroom, leaving them standing completely alone in the grand foyer. Despite the glaring reality that the head of security treated me like absolute royalty, my parents' immense arrogance acted as an impenetrable shield against the actual truth of the situation. Instead of connecting the obvious dots right in front of them, they immediately rationalized the entire interaction to perfectly fit their delusional worldview. I could hear William muttering confidently to Susan as they followed me into the venue, assuming I had somehow simply charmed a security guard or managed to score a pathetic job as a designated seat filler for the corporate event. They aggressively convinced themselves that I was just a tragic nobody, trying to pretend I was important, completely unaware that I was the entire reason this massive gala was happening tonight. They squared their shoulders, plastered their fake smiles back onto their faces, and proudly strutted into the ballroom to find Brittany and Jamal. They were so blinded by their own monumental egos that they could not see the massive corporate guillotine hanging directly above their heads. The storm was no longer approaching in the distance. It was already here, and they had just eagerly taken their reserved seats right in the absolute dead center of the blast zone, completely ready to be destroyed. Absolutely destroyed. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended high above the main ballroom began to dim slowly, casting a dramatic cinematic shadow over the sprawling sea of elite investors. The ambient chatter of the city's wealthiest venture capitalists and technology moguls faded into a focused, electrified silence. Hundreds of high-net-worth individuals took their seats at the immaculate circular tables, their eyes turning toward the towering presentation screen at the front of the room. The atmosphere was charged with intense high-stakes corporate anticipation, a feeling of immense power. Right in the absolute dead center of the front row, perfectly positioned just 10 feet from the main stage, sat my family. Jamal had aggressively claimed the center chair, spreading his arms wide and crossing his legs to display maximum arrogance in his rented tuxedo. He was completely surrounded by billionaires, yet he wore a smug, untouchable smirk, thoroughly convinced that tonight would permanently catapult him into their exclusive ranks. To his immediate left, William and Susan sat ramrod straight, their faces glowing with immense, unearned pride. Susan was practically vibrating with excitement, her hands tightly clutching her sequined evening bag as she scanned the room, desperately hoping the wealthy executives nearby were noticing her family prominent seating placement. William leaned back confidently, projecting the image of a seasoned patriarch about to watch his corporate dynasty unfold. They were basking in a glorious, fraudulent triumph. Backstage, completely hidden from the audience, Brittany was pacing relentlessly. The heavy velvet curtains concealed her frantic movements as she obsessively reviewed her stolen pitch cards for the 100th time. The digital preview monitors mounted on the backstage wall prominently displayed the opening slide for her upcoming presentation. The fraudulent logo for B Logistics glowed brightly, mocking the thousands of hours of legitimate programming I had sacrificed to build the actual architecture. Brittany was sweating lightly under the harsh backstage lighting, but her massive ego easily overpowered her anxiety. She truly believed she was a genius. She honestly thought she could walk out onto that stage, regurgitate my stolen technical specifications, and walk away with a $5 million seed fund and a guaranteed promotion to vice president. She adjusted her designer blazer, completely ready to step into the spotlight and claim a fortune she did not earn. I sat just a few feet away from my family in the VIP seating section, completely enveloped in the shadows of the dimmed ballroom. The head of security had positioned me perfectly. I had an unobstructed view of the stage and a flawless direct angle to watch every single micro-expression on the faces of my parents and my brother-in-law. I crossed my legs, smoothed the immaculate fabric of my midnight blue custom suit, and waited in silence. The trap was entirely primed. The execution was imminent. A sudden sharp beam of white light cut through the darkness, illuminating the center of the stage. The heavy silence in the ballroom broke as Richard, the chief executive officer of Apex Capital, stepped out from behind the velvet curtains. He walked toward the main podium with the undeniable predatory confidence of a man who controlled billions of dollars in global assets. He did not need to ask for quiet. The sheer magnitude of his corporate authority commanded absolute immediate silence from the entire room. Even the most arrogant billionaires in the audience sat up straight and focused their complete attention on the stage. Richard adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd, his piercing gaze sweeping across the front row before locking briefly and almost imperceptibly onto my position in the VIP section. A tiny, ruthless smile touched the corner of his lips. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen!" Richard's deep, authoritative voice echoed flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Welcome to the annual Apex Capital Investor Gala. Tonight we are gathered to celebrate innovation, aggressive expansion, and the future of global market dominance. As you know, our standard agenda for this evening features several presentations from our internal investment directors who will pitch new ventures for our consideration. Down in the front row, I watched Jamal confidently nudge William with his elbow. William nodded proudly, leaning forward in his seat, ready to watch Brittany conquer the stage. They were so incredibly eager, completely blind to the executioner raising the axe directly above them. Richard paused, letting his opening remarks settle over the wealthy audience. He gripped the edges of the podium and leaned forward entirely, shifting the energy in the massive ballroom. However, Richard continued, his voice dropping into a serious, highly dramatic register. Before we hear any of the internal pitches tonight, I have made a sudden alteration to our agenda. We have a monumental announcement that requires your immediate attention. Apex Capital has not just been looking for internal startups to fund. We have been actively hunting for a massive industry-defining acquisition. And tonight I am incredibly proud to announce that we have just closed our largest and most lucrative technology acquisition of the entire fiscal year. The ballroom erupted into loud, impressed murmurs. The elite investors immediately leaned toward each other, whispering frantically about the massive scale of the deal. Down in the front row, the smug arrogance on Jamal's face faltered for the very first time. His confident posture stiffened noticeably. William and Susan exchanged a highly confused, nervous glance, their manufactured high society smiles slipping instantly. This unexpected corporate announcement was absolutely not on the schedule Brittany had given them. The spotlight tightened directly on Richard as he raised his hand to silence the excited crowd, perfectly setting the stage for the absolute devastating destruction of my family's fraudulent empire. The ballroom remained in a state of absolute breathless silence as Richard lowered his hand. He gripped the edges of the polished wooden podium, leaning forward to address the elite crowd of billionaires and venture capitalists. For the past decade, Richard began his voice resonating with deep, unwavering authority. The global supply chain has been crippled by devastating inefficiencies. We have seen multinational shipping conglomerates bleed billions of dollars due to unpredictable freight delays, warehouse bottlenecks, and archaic routing systems. Apex Capital has spent the last 3 years actively searching for a technological solution to this massive global crisis. We evaluated hundreds of startups, reviewed thousands of portfolios, and rejected every single one of them. None of them possessed the necessary architectural brilliance to truly disrupt the industry. Until this month. Richard paused, allowing the immense weight of his words to settle over the captivated audience. Down in the front row, William and Susan sat completely rigid. Jamal adjusted his rented bow tie, leaning forward eagerly. They were desperately trying to connect Richard's speech to Brittany's upcoming presentation, their greedy minds racing to calculate if this announcement somehow involved her fraudulent logistics project. But the sheer scale of what Richard was describing dwarfed Brittany's pathetic $5 million seed fund request. We did not find a startup. Richard continued, his tone sharp and triumphant. We found a single solitary visionary. We discovered an artificial intelligence platform so incredibly advanced, so flawlessly programmed, that it can predict and reroute global shipping logistics before a bottleneck even occurs. It is an algorithmic masterpiece. And tonight, I am profoundly honored to officially confirm that Apex Capital has acquired this proprietary software. We executed a full corporate buyout for a finalized price of $40 million. A collective gasp of absolute awe rippled through the massive ballroom. Investors murmured enthusiastically, highly impressed by the staggering acquisition cost. In the front row, Jamal's eyes widened with intense greed, completely oblivious to the impending execution. William grinned widely at Susan, entirely convinced they were about to witness a historic financial victory for their firm. Richard raised his voice, cutting through the excited chatter of the elite crowd. He looked directly at the VIP section. The creator of this revolutionary software built her empire entirely from scratch. She refused traditional educational paths, choosing instead to write every single line of this groundbreaking code through her own sheer willpower. She operated in total anonymity, letting her flawless architecture speak entirely for itself. We are immensely proud to have her join the highest ranks of our executive leadership. Richard extended his hand toward the darkened balcony. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the VIP mezzanine. Join me in welcoming our newest equity partner and the absolute genius behind the code, Madison. A blinding high-intensity spotlight instantly snapped on, slicing through the darkened ballroom and locking directly onto my position. I stood at the edge of the glass railing, bathed in brilliant white light, looking down at the hundreds of wealthy investors turning in their seats to applaud me. I did not wave. I simply buttoned the center button of my midnight blue custom suit and began my slow, highly deliberate descent down the grand glass staircase. The applause echoed like thunder, but I tuned it all out. My eyes were fixed exclusively on the absolute center of the front row. The physical reactions of my family were a masterpiece of total agonizing destruction. Jamal was the first to comprehend the horrific reality. His jaw physically dropped, his mouth hanging open in an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The arrogant swagger completely vanished from his posture. His shoulders slumped, and he gripped the edge of his table as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath him. This was the exact same man who had maliciously offered me $200 for a cheap motel. He was now staring up at a $40 million executive partner, and the sheer terror of his monumental mistake was actively paralyzing his brain. Beside him, Susan let out a sharp, audible gasp that carried clearly over the rising applause. Both of her hands flew up to cover her mouth. Her heavily beaded dress shook violently as her entire body trembled. The color completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking sickly and deeply panicked. She stared at me descending the stairs, her eyes wide with overwhelming horror. All of her country club lies, all of her vicious insults about my lack of ambition, instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her face. William was faring much worse. The patriarchal dominance he loved to project was entirely eradicated. He gripped the armrests of his plush chair so tightly that his knuckles turned stark bone white. His jaw was clenched, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a terrifying ghost. The realization that he had brutally kicked his incredibly wealthy daughter out into the freezing rain was visibly destroying his mind. He was completely trapped in his seat, unable to look away from my commanding approach. Meanwhile, hidden just behind the heavy velvet curtains of the main stage, Brittany was experiencing her own personal apocalypse. I could see her clutching the edge of the curtain, peering out at the illuminated stage. Her face was completely pale white, entirely devoid of blood. The stolen pitch cards she had been obsessively rehearsing slipped from her trembling hands, scattering uselessly across the dark backstage floor. The horrifying truth crashed down on her. The software she was planning to pitch to Apex Capital was already owned by Apex Capital. The artificial intelligence code she had stolen from a damp basement actually belonged to the newly minted equity partner, currently walking toward the microphone. She was totally ruined. I reached the bottom of the staircase and strode powerfully down the center aisle, passing my hyperventilating family without offering them a single glance, absolutely ready to finish them off. I stepped up the short staircase to the main stage, the polished wood solid beneath my stilettos. Richard met me at the podium, extending his hand in a gesture of profound professional respect. We shook hands, a silent acknowledgement of the absolute destruction about to commence. He handed me the sleek wireless microphone and stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to me. I turned to face the massive ballroom. The bright spotlight tracked my movement, capturing the sharp lines of my midnight blue suit. Hundreds of the wealthiest, most influential investors in the country sat in absolute silence, waiting to hear from the architect who just secured a $40 million payout. I stood tall, feeling the immense weight of the microphone in my hand. Every single night, I spent coding in isolation. Every cruel remark I swallowed in that damp basement culminated in this exact second of pure retribution. I did not look at the billionaires in the back. I did not look at the hedge fund managers in the center. I directed my piercing gaze straight down to the absolute dead center of the front row. William, Susan, and Jamal were physically paralyzed under the harsh glare of my attention. Their previous arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating primal terror. They were utterly trapped under the bright lights, forced to sit perfectly still, while the daughter they had violently discarded held the ultimate position of power. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not rush. I let the heavy electrified tension stretch across the room for several agonizing seconds. The entire room waited. "Thank you, Richard." I began, my voice steady, cold, and echoing flawlessly across the silent venue. "It is funny, just 3 weeks ago my family told me I was uneducated trash and threw me out on the street. I guess high school dropouts can still do math." The words sliced through the formal corporate atmosphere like a razor blade. I watched the devastating impact of my statement strike my family with physical force. Susan slumped back against her chair, her heavily beaded dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She brought a trembling hand to her throat, her eyes darting nervously toward the elite investors sitting at the adjacent tables. The social standing she valued above her own flesh and blood was disintegrating in real time. William stared at his polished shoes, completely unable to meet my eyes. The patriarchal superiority he loved to wield had been entirely obliterated by an 8-figure bank account. He was publicly exposed as a cruel, abusive failure of a father in front of the very financial titans he desperately wanted to impress. Beside them, Jamal looked physically ill. The rented tuxedo he wore seemed to choke him. He was a low-level analyst who had aggressively mocked an equity partner, and he knew his Wall Street career was currently standing on the edge of a massive cliff. I let the brutal reality of their public exposure settle deeply into their bones. I had promised myself a public execution, and the blade had just begun to fall. The audience murmurs in shock. The pristine, highly controlled environment of the elite investment gala instantly gave way to frantic, hushed whispers. Billionaires and venture capitalists leaned toward one another, astounded by the raw, brutal honesty of my opening statement. High society corporate events were typically filled with sterile, sanitized speeches praising teamwork and innovation. They were absolutely not accustomed to witnessing a newly minted, multi-million-dollar executive openly annihilate her abusive relatives from the main stage. I let the uncomfortable, heavy tension build within the room. I wanted William and Susan to feel the scorching heat of 100 wealthy investors judging them with profound disgust. I wanted Jamal to drown in the immense humiliation of his own manufactured arrogance. They had spent years trying to make me feel small, and now they were suffocating under the immense pressure of their own exposure. But I was not finished. The public shaming of their character was merely the opening act. It was time to spring the trap they had so eagerly set for themselves. I turned slightly away from the paralyzed front row and faced the massive presentation screen towering behind the podium. I raised a sleek remote control in my right hand, aiming it squarely at the primary projector lens. "Now I hear my sister Brittany has a pitch for you all tonight," I announced, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the lingering whispers of the crowd. "Let us take a look at her revolutionary project." I pressed the button on the remote. The gigantic screen instantly flared to life, illuminating the entire stage with a blinding bright white light. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the heavy velvet curtains backstage shifting violently. Brittany was standing just a few feet away in the shadows, completely frozen in a state of absolute waking nightmare. She had spent the last 3 weeks bragging about how she was going to dominate this boardroom and secure a massive promotion. She had aggressively demanded front-row seats for her parents to witness her corporate triumph. Now she was trapped in the dark, watching her dropout sister hijack her presentation in front of the firm chief executive officer. The screen displayed the exact opening slide of her stolen pitch deck. The fraudulent logo for B Logistics glowed massively above my head, featuring Brittany, name printed boldly, as the visionary founder and chief executive officer. Jamal was listed right below her as the chief financial officer. The audience quieted down again, confused by the sudden pivot to a seemingly standard corporate presentation. They assumed I was graciously introducing my sister's software project as a gesture of professional goodwill. They had absolutely no idea they were looking at digital contraband. Down in the front row, Jamal began to hyperventilate. He recognized his own stolen file projected on the screen. He realized in that exact terrifying second that I had hacked into his unsecure cloud drive. The walls were closing in rapidly, and the true execution was finally underway. The absolute destruction was completely inevitable now. I pressed the button on my remote a second time. The massive screen behind me split perfectly down the middle. On the left side of the display, the glossy corporate branded interface of B Logistics vanished, replaced by the raw underlying algorithmic architecture Brittany and Jamal had submitted to the executive board for their $5 million seed fund. On the right side of the screen, my own highly encrypted federally copyrighted source code appeared. It was the exact same proprietary code that Richard and the Apex Capital Board had just purchased for $40 million. A collective confused murmur rippled through the audience of billionaire investors. From a distance to anyone without a deep background in software engineering, the two panels of densely packed text might have looked like random numbers and technical jargon. But I was not presenting to a room full of amateurs. I was presenting to the sharpest technology venture capitalists in the country. They knew exactly how to read a software framework. I clicked the remote a third time. Bright crimson highlights illuminated massive blocks of data on both sides of the split screen. The algorithms matched line for line, variable for variable, equation for equation. Every single predictive routing model, every warehouse optimization sequence, and every automated freight allocation script was completely identical. The only minor differences were clumsy, amateurish attempts to alter the variable names. Jamal had lazily gone through the files using a basic search and replace function, changing my original tracking tags to his own simplistic financial acronyms. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to mask a blatant digital heist. I zoomed in on the foundational machine learning core, projecting it massively across the ballroom wall. I directed the crowd to look closely at the architecture on the left side, the code my sister claimed she built entirely from scratch in her spare time. Embedded deep within the neural network training sets was a highly specific string of alphanumeric characters. I clicked the remote one final time. A digital magnifying glass effect isolated that specific string on the screen. It was not a functional piece of the logistics software. It was a customized, invisible digital watermark I had hard-coded into the structural foundation of my offline backup servers years ago. The watermark clearly displayed my personal corporate entity registration number and the exact date I originally wrote the code. It was absolute, undeniable proof of ownership permanently burned into the digital fabric of the program. The silence in the grand ballroom transformed from confused anticipation into a heavy, suffocating realization. The elite executives sitting in the audience were quickly connecting the dots. They were looking at a side-by-side comparison of a legitimate $40 million corporate acquisition and a brazen, unedited counterfeit. The undeniable visual evidence of the stolen architecture loomed massively above the stage, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the front row where my family sat, entirely paralyzed by their impending absolute total ruin. I stepped away from the podium and walked to the very edge of the stage, bringing the microphone back to my lips. As you can see, Brittany Project is an exact copy of my hard drive, I announced, my voice slicing effortlessly through the thick tension in the room. This is not innovation, this is corporate espionage and federal intellectual property theft. The immediate reaction was chaotic. Gasps echoed from the investor tables as the severity of the accusation settled in. A crime of this magnitude committed inside the walls of Apex Capital was unprecedented. Behind me, the heavy velvet curtains suddenly tore open. Brittany stumbled out from the backstage shadows and into the harsh glare of the stage lights. She looked completely deranged. Her immaculate designer blazer was rumpled, her hair slightly disheveled from nervously running her hands through it. She rushed toward the center of the stage, her high heels catching awkwardly on the polished wood floor. She threw her hands out defensively, desperately trying to salvage her shattered reputation in front of the firm chief executive officer and the entire executive board. "That is a total lie," Brittany shrieked into the microphone stand's empty space, her voice cracking with wild panic. "She stole it from me. I built B Logistics. She hacked my files and planted that watermark to frame me. I am an investment director. She is just a dropout. She is lying to all of you. Her frantic stammering was truly pathetic. She was aggressively pointing her finger at me, but she could not even formulate a coherent technical defense, because she had absolutely no idea how the algorithms actually functioned. She was regurgitating meaningless business buzzwords to a room full of technology billionaires who could clearly see the indisputable digital forensics projected behind us. I did not even bother to defend myself. I just let her scream her empty lies into the void, watching her completely destroy her own professional credibility with every frantic word. Down in the front row, Jamal was having a vastly different reaction to the exposure. Unlike his wife Jamal, fully comprehended the severe legal ramifications of the federal crimes they had committed. The massive arrogance that had defined his entire personality completely vanished. He physically shrank back into his plush chair, desperately trying to make himself invisible. Massive beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, soaking the stiff collar of his rented tuxedo. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits. He could see the elite security team shifting into position, blocking every single doorway. He knew his Wall Street career was completely over. He knew he was facing severe federal prison time. While Brittany continued to loudly humiliate herself on stage, throwing a desperate, unhinged temper tantrum in front of the city's wealthiest elite, Jamal just sat there trembling violently. He was absolutely terrified, hopelessly drowning right now in a very deep and completely inescapable pool of his own miserable making. I let Brittany exhaust her lungs, her shrill accusations bouncing harmlessly off the acoustic panels of the grand ballroom. The billionaire investors were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with the cold, clinical disgust reserved for a terrible liar caught red-handed. She was a sinking ship, and Jamal was already drowning. But I was not finished. The public execution of my toxic family required absolute total eradication. I raised the sleek remote control in my right hand once again. And while we are discussing fraud, I announced, my voice cutting effortlessly through Brittany's pathetic screaming, let us look at the financial integrity of my parents, William and Susan. I pressed the button. The split screen showing the stolen artificial intelligence architecture vanished entirely. In its place, towering 40 feet high for every single financial titan in Chicago to see, appeared a highly detailed commercial loan agreement. Down in the front row, Susan stopped breathing. The oxygen seemed to instantly and violently exit her lungs. She grabbed her chest, her expensive sequined evening bag slipping from her trembling fingers and crashing onto the marble floor. William slumped backward in his plush VIP chair. His entire face turned a sickly, horrifying shade of ash gray. The arrogant patriarch who had loudly bragged to his country club friends just hours ago was now completely paralyzed by the glaring digital evidence projected above him. They were pinned under the brightest spotlights in the city, entirely unable to escape the monumental exposure of their own criminality. The elite investors in the audience leaned forward, adjusting their glasses to read the massive text. I walked slowly across the polished stage, pointing directly at the financial documents. My parents loved to project an image of massive generational wealth, I explained to the captivated, completely silent crowd. They constantly boast about their family logistics business. They wear custom-tailored suits and attend exclusive country club luncheons to mingle with many of the people sitting in this exact room. But the truth is entirely different. Their business is completely bankrupt. They are aggressively defaulting on their fleet leases. They are bleeding cash every single day to maintain a pathetic illusion of upper-class superiority. I clicked the remote, magnifying the financial details of the loan for the entire audience. The banking elite sitting at the pristine tables gasped audibly. To a room full of venture capitalists and private equity managers, financial fraud was the ultimate cardinal sin. They despised anyone who manipulated debt to fake success. To save their dying business, they needed a fast, desperate cash injection. I continued pacing the edge of the stage, but their own credit was entirely destroyed by years of severe financial mismanagement. So they turned to the daughter they kept hidden in their basement. I shifted the slide to page 4 of the massive corporate document. A bright red circle illuminated the guarantor section at the absolute bottom of the page. There, displayed for the wealthiest individuals in the country to analyze, was my forged signature. They forged my signature to take out a $150,000 high-interest loan. I stated, my voice ringing with lethal clarity. They threw me out of their house into the freezing rain. They called me a lazy burden. They called me an uneducated dropout. They threw my clothes into garbage bags. But they secretly chained this massive commercial debt to my Social Security number. They assumed a community college dropout would never have the financial literacy or the high-powered legal representation to check her own credit score. They assumed I was entirely disposable. The sheer disgust radiating from the audience was palpable. Powerful executives shook their heads in absolute revulsion. William tried to open his mouth to offer a defense, to spin some pathetic narrative about a family misunderstanding, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just sat there, suffocating under the immense, crushing weight of public humiliation. Susan was openly weeping now, ruining her expensive makeup, finally realizing that her precious social standing was permanently annihilated. But they made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation, I announced, turning to look directly at Richard, who stood at the edge of the stage watching the execution, with a sharp, approving smile. I turned back to my parents. That predatory debt they fraudulently secured was recently packaged and sold to a larger institutional buyer. That buyer was Apex Capital. You forged my name on a loan that is now legally owned by the very firm standing in this room. William let out a choked, desperate gasp. The horrific reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the force of a falling skyscraper. He had walked into the Apex Tower hoping to celebrate his golden daughter. Instead, he had walked directly into the headquarters of his primary creditor. I stepped right to the edge of the stage, looking straight down into my father's terrified eyes. Apex Capital currently holds the debt to your logistics company, I declared, projecting absolute merciless dominance. As a major equity partner at Apex, I have full authorization over my own distressed asset portfolios. I am calling that debt in tonight. The final blow landed with devastating precision. William buried his face in his hands, completely broken. Susan wailed quietly, her entire fake reality shattering into millions of irreparable pieces. Their business was dead. Their reputation was dead. I had successfully orchestrated their total financial destruction, and I had done it without breaking a single sweat. Richard stepped forward from the shadows of the podium, his presence amplifying the absolute finality of my declaration. He did not need a microphone to make his fury known. He raised his right hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the Apex Capital security detail stationed around the perimeter. The towering men in black suits instantly collapsed their perimeter, moving with terrifying synchronized military precision straight toward the front row and the center stage. Brittany was still standing in the harsh glare of the stage lights, her chest heaving as panic completely rewired her brain. Richard looked at her with a level of professional disgust that could freeze boiling water. Brittany, Richard announced, his voice slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom. Effective immediately, your employment at Apex Capital is permanently terminated. You are hereby barred from this building, from our networks, and from ever contacting this firm again. We will be cooperating fully with federal authorities regarding your corporate espionage. 2 massive security guards flanked her instantly. One of them reached out and unceremoniously ripped the high-level security clearance badge right off the lapel of her designer blazer. The physical snapping of the lanyard echoed loudly in the quiet room. Brittany let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, her hands desperately reaching out as if she could somehow grab her evaporating career out of thin air. Down in the front row, Jamal watched his wife being physically stripped of her corporate identity. The reality of federal prison was staring him directly in the face. Jamal was an analyst. He dealt in risk assessment, and he knew instantly that his wife was a sinking asset with zero remaining value. If he went down for intellectual property theft, his lucrative Wall Street licenses would be permanently revoked. His entire livelihood would be reduced to ash. He made his calculation in a fraction of a second. Jamal shot up from his plush chair, knocking it backward onto the marble floor. He aggressively backed away from William and Susan, raising his hands high in the air in a gesture of frantic surrender. She stole it. Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with absolute terror as he pointed a shaking finger directly at Brittany on the stage. I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I did not know it was stolen. It was entirely her idea. She found the drive in the basement and brought it to me. I thought it was her own code. The sheer cowardice of his betrayal sent a secondary shockwave through the elite audience. The wealthy investors watched in absolute revulsion as a man aggressively threw his own wife into the federal fire to save his own skin. Jamal was sweating profusely, his rented tuxedo clinging to his trembling frame. "I swear to God," Jamal continued shouting, addressing Richard and the billionaires surrounding him. "She manipulated me. She said she built it. I am an innocent victim in her scheme." Brittany stared down at her husband from the stage, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The flawless high society marriage they had constantly shoved in my face completely fractured in a matter of seconds. "You lying coward!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking as two security guards restrained her arms. "You are the one who ran the decryption scripts. You told me we could trick the board. You said we would be rich." They began screaming viciously at each other, tearing apart their fake perfect union right in front of the most powerful financial titans in the city. Their ugly, desperate true colors were fully exposed for everyone to witness. While Brittany and Jamal aggressively tore each other to pieces, William and Susan remained completely paralyzed in the front row. They were surrounded by the screaming wreckage of their golden child and their perfect son-in-law. 4 additional security guards closed in on my parents. "Sir, Mom, it is time to leave the premises," the head of security ordered coldly. William tried to stand, but his legs trembled so violently he stumbled against the table. Susan burst into loud, humiliating sobs. She desperately reached out toward the wealthy country club friends she had bragged to just hours ago, hoping for any shred of sympathy. Instead, the affluent couples physically turned their backs, refusing to even make eye contact with convicted fraudsters. The guards did not offer them the dignity of a quiet exit. They firmly grabbed William and Susan by their arms, hauling them up from their premium seats. The security detail formed a tight wall around the screaming, sobbing family members and began forcefully marching them up the center aisle of the grand ballroom. This was their absolute worst nightmare come to life. They were being walked out of an elite billionaire gala, completely stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their arrogant pride. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching them take the longest, most humiliating walk of their miserable lives. The elite investors sat in silent, condemning judgment as my family was marched past their tables. The social standing my mother valued more than her own daughter was permanently annihilated. The legacy my father so desperately wanted to protect was completely reduced to federal fraud and public disgrace. They had walked into the apex tower believing they were untouchable royalty. They were being dragged out as pathetic, desperate criminals. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open, and the security guards shoved my family out into the cold, unforgiving marble lobby. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them with a loud, definitive thud, sealing them out of my world forever. The massive, beautiful ballroom was quiet once again. I turned away from the closed doors, my posture immaculate, and looked out over the sea of investors, who were now staring at me with profound, unwavering respect. I had executed my promise flawlessly. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in high society validation. After the colossal shockwave of my presentation subsided, the gala seamlessly transitioned into a lavish networking reception. But the entire hierarchy of the room had fundamentally shifted. The elite investors, venture capitalists, and technology billionaires who had previously ignored my existence now actively flocked to my side. They offered enthusiastic handshakes, exchanged premium business cards, and proposed incredibly lucrative future partnerships. I navigated the sea of wealth with practiced, immaculate composure, securing my permanent position at the absolute top of the Chicago financial food chain. I remained at the apex tower until the final catered plates were cleared and the heavy brass doors began to close for the night. I said my professional goodbyes to Richard, collected my structured leather briefcase, and confidently took the private executive elevator down to the subterranean VIP parking structure. The underground garage was dead quiet, a massive cavern of gray concrete and harsh flickering fluorescent lights. The air down there was damp and freezing, a stark contrast to the warm, glittering ballroom I had just conquered. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my stiletto heels echoed loudly across the empty parking bays. My designated chauffeur was already standing attentively beside the sleek black sedan, holding the rear passenger door open for my arrival. I was completely ready to sink into the heated leather seats and return to the absolute silence of my luxury penthouse. But as I approached the idling vehicle, two pathetic, shivering figures slowly emerged from the dark shadows of a concrete pillar. It was William and Susan. They had not left the premises. After being forcefully ejected from the gala by the security team, they had somehow managed to sneak down the exit ramp into the restricted parking garage, choosing to wait in the freezing cold for hours just to ambush my departure. The physical deterioration of their appearance was incredibly satisfying to witness. The arrogant high society facade they had proudly worn into the building was completely annihilated. William's perfectly tailored tuxedo was rumpled and stained with dirty water from the parking garage floor. His shoulders were severely hunched, his chest hollowed out, entirely stripped of his patriarchal dominance. Susan looked absolutely horrific. Her heavily beaded evening gown hung loosely on her trembling frame, and her expensive makeup was completely destroyed, running down her face in dark, jagged streaks from hours of hysterical crying. As soon as they saw me approaching the car, they rushed forward, their expensive shoes dragging heavily against the harsh concrete. Madison William choked out, his voice cracking with deep, agonizing desperation. He physically threw himself toward me, stopping just inches away from my chauffeur, who immediately stepped forward to block his path. William ignored the driver, clasping his trembling hands together in a gesture of pure, unadulterated begging. "Please, Madison, you have to listen to us. You cannot do this to our logistics company. You cannot call in that debt. It will absolutely destroy us. We will lose the trucks, we will lose the house, we will lose everything we have ever built." I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, looking at the man who had violently thrown me out of his house just 3 weeks ago. He was actively weeping, his chest heaving with desperate sobs as he stared at my pristine midnight blue suit. He was completely broken, begging for his financial life from the exact same daughter he had relentlessly called a useless, uneducated burden. Susan pushed her way past William, practically falling to her knees on the filthy concrete floor. She reached out with her shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my jacket, but I took a sharp, calculated step backward, ensuring she could not touch me. "Madison, please!" Susan wailed loudly, her voice echoing shrilly across the empty parking structure. "You have made your point. You proved that you are successful. You won. You humiliated us in front of the entire city. Is that not enough for you? We have absolutely nothing left. Brittany is facing federal charges, Jamal is filing for divorce, and we are going to be completely homeless." I looked down at her tear-streaked face with absolute freezing indifference. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt absolutely nothing for these people. I turned away from their pathetic groveling and smoothly slid into the spacious back seat of the luxury sedan. My chauffeur immediately moved to close the heavy armored door, but Susan threw her hands against the window, her face pressed desperately against the glass. I signaled the driver to wait. I pressed the control button on the armrest, rolling the tinted window down, just a few inches to let the freezing garage air into the pristine cabin. "Madison, please!" Susan cried out, her voice raw and completely stripped of all its former arrogance. "You are rich now. You just made $40 million. You can easily forgive the $150,000. It is just pocket change to you now. We are your family." I reached calmly into my structured leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick, heavy stack of legal filings my corporate litigation team had prepared earlier that afternoon. The documents clearly outlined the undeniable federal wire fraud, the aggravated identity theft, and the predatory loan they had illegally forged in my name. I held the heavy stack of paper in my hand, looking directly into my mother's terrified, pleading eyes. "I am just an uneducated dropout, Mom," I replied, my voice slicing through the cold air with absolute lethal precision. "I do not know how to spell forgiveness. See you in federal court." I casually tossed the massive stack of legal lawsuit papers directly out the window. The heavy documents hit William and Susan squarely in the chest before scattering violently across the dirty, wet concrete at their feet. I did not wait to watch them scramble for the papers. I pressed the button on my armrest. The heavy tinted glass window rolled up smoothly and silently, completely cutting off Susan's miserable, agonizing wails. The chauffeur immediately put the luxury sedan into gear, and the car glided effortlessly toward the exit ramp, leaving my parents kneeling in the dark, suffocating in the toxic, inescapable wreckage of their own creation. 6 months passed since that freezing night in the underground parking garage. The swift, brutal machinery of federal law and corporate vengeance moved exactly as I had orchestrated. Jamal was the very first domino to fall. In a desperate attempt to save his own skin and protect his lucrative licenses, he filed for divorce from Brittany less than 48 hours after the gala. He hired an expensive defense attorney and tried to spin a manufactured narrative to the regulatory boards, claiming he was a naive victim who had been manipulated by his deceitful wife. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority was entirely unimpressed. The digital footprint he left on my servers was undeniable proof of his active participation in the intellectual property theft. Jamal was permanently stripped of his trading licenses and entirely blacklisted from Wall Street forever. No reputable financial institution in the country would let him in the building for a job interview. He was forced to move out of his luxury apartment, trading his tailored suits for a miserable entry-level data entry job that barely paid his monthly rent. Brittany faced an even harsher reality. Richard and the ruthless legal department at Apex Capital showed her absolutely zero mercy. They handed all the evidence over to federal prosecutors without hesitation. Facing decades in federal prison for corporate espionage and intellectual property theft, Brittany was forced to take a humiliating plea deal. She received 5 years of strict felony probation and a permanent ban from working in any sector of the financial or technology industries. Her prestigious Harvard Master of Business Administration degree, the core of her massive ego, was rendered completely worthless overnight. The golden child who spent her entire life looking down on everyone else was now a convicted felon, legally barred from the corporate world she once believed she ruled. William and Susan faced the ultimate destruction of their fake high society empire. When my legal team officially called in the $150,000 fraudulent debt, their failing trucking logistics company immediately collapsed into Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Creditors swarmed their remaining assets like hungry vultures. The commercial bank aggressively seized their remaining fleet of trucks, locking the gates of their business forever. But the corporate bankruptcy was not enough to cover the massive federal fraud they had committed by forging my signature. To avoid being indicted for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud, my parents were forced to completely liquidate their personal lives. They sold their massive suburban home, auctioned off their luxury vehicles, and pawned Susan's expensive jewelry just to settle the crushing financial penalties. The elite country club instantly revoked their membership, and their wealthy socialite friends entirely abandoned them, refusing to associate with exposed criminals. My parents were forced to move into a cramped, depressing rental apartment on the industrial outskirts of Chicago, suffocating in the miserable reality they had once mocked me for enduring. They spent their days blaming each other for the collapse, their toxic marriage fracturing under the intense pressure of poverty. With my family permanently handled and my $40 million acquisition completely finalized, I packed my bags and left Chicago for good. I did not look back. I boarded a private flight to California and relocated directly to the sun-drenched hills of Silicon Valley. I purchased a stunning, secluded estate surrounded by towering redwoods, a place where the air felt clean and the future felt entirely open. I did not retire to a life of quiet, idle luxury. I took a significant portion of my newfound wealth and founded a specialized technology incubator right in the heart of the valley. My incubator does not accept applications from Ivy League graduates or elite business school alumni. We focus entirely on the underdogs. We actively fund and mentor self-taught coders, brilliant community college dropouts, and fiercely dedicated individuals whom the traditional corporate system has unfairly labeled as uneducated or unworthy. I spend my days walking through the collaborative workspaces, investing my capital and expertise into young men and women who possess the exact same relentless drive that kept me coding in that dark, damp basement. I give them the resources, the server space, and the vital financial backing my own family violently denied me. I watch them build incredible software platforms disrupting entire industries, and I am reminded every single day that pure raw talent does not require a prestigious piece of paper to validate its worth. The journey from being a despised outcast to becoming a Silicon Valley venture capitalist taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. Toxic people will always try to project their own severe limitations onto you. They will try to lock you in a box, label you a failure, and demand that you accept their cruel judgment as your permanent reality. But you do not have to accept their narrative. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you. Sharing DNA with someone is not a free pass for them to relentlessly disrespect your boundaries, steal your peace, or sabotage your future. If you are currently trapped in a situation where your family or your peers constantly diminish your worth, do not waste your precious energy screaming back at them. Do not beg for their validation. Take all of your pain, all of your frustration, and channel it directly into your own unrelenting ambition. Build your empire in the dark. Let your silence be your strategy, and your success be their executioner. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If my journey resonated with you, or if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own future, please share your experiences in the comments below. We read every single one. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving betrayal and claiming your ultimate victory. Keep building, keep fighting, and never let anyone tell you that your potential is limited. The story of Madison, who transformed herself from a rejected college dropout into a triumphant multi-million-dollar software founder, offers a profound lesson about self-worth. When surrounded by toxic individuals who continuously belittle your potential, it is dangerously easy to internalize their destructive narratives. Madison's family violently branded her a failure simply because she chose a non-traditional educational path. However, the core lesson here is that your value is not dictated by the narrow minds of those who refuse to understand you. Instead of engaging in pointless screaming matches or desperately begging for her parents' approval, Madison weaponized her silence. She recognized that arguing with people committed to misunderstanding her was a complete waste of energy. She channeled her pain into relentless focus, building a revolutionary artificial intelligence empire in the dark. Her journey proves that true validation cannot be given or taken away by others. It must be actively cultivated from within. When the people who should protect you choose to exploit you, instead, the healthiest response is to completely outgrow their reach. Madison's ultimate victory wasn't merely the massive financial payout or the public exposure of her family's corporate fraud. It was her unshakable confidence in her own abilities. She refused to let her lack of a prestigious university degree define her ceiling. By eventually founding a Silicon Valley incubator for other self-taught underdogs, she demonstrated that raw talent, resilience, and perseverance will always outshine unearned arrogance and superficial credentials. Ultimately, this powerful narrative reminds us that we are the sole architects of our own destinies, and we must stop handing the pen to those who only wish to scribble over our life's masterpiece. If you are currently facing unwarranted judgment from those around you, stop seeking their validation and start building your own empire in the dark today.